Welcome back. I want to talk about heart anatomy and blood flow. So if you haven't subscribed to my channel, go ahead and do so. And some of the things that I discuss you will find on our learning management system for the course. But if you are not in my class, you may want to just take like a screenshot or a picture of the slide that I'm on at that time, and that way you can just print it out and utilize it. So with heart anatomy and blood flow, when we talk about circulation, there really are like three types of circulation with heart. So you have like pulmonary circulation, you would have coronary circulation, so supplying the tissues of the heart, the muscle tissue. And then you would also have systemic circulation. So that's going from one system, the circulatory system, into another system, right? So supplying the organs of the body. But I really want to focus in on what are the parts of the heart and how things flow through it, right? So how do we go from having deoxygenated blood to having oxygenated blood within the heart, and how does that leave the heart and get to the heart and things like that? So when we look at the heart, you have four chambers that make up the human heart, right? So these four chambers, you would have one here, right? You have one here, so you have two on top. And then I think of the bottom as being kind of a V shape, and each chamber has sort of a V shape. And you would end up with a chamber on the bottom left and bottom right, right? So if you think of it as your patient, you would have this as their right side of their body, which is our left when we're looking at the screen. But on the patient, it's their right. And then on this side, this would be the left side of their body, right? And we would name these based off of anatomical positioning of that patient. So identifying those major chambers, let's also think about what type of blood would be there. Would it be oxygenated or would it be deoxygenated blood? There's several arrows on this diagram. Just bear with me as we kind of go through them and start filling in the spaces that we have. But the arrows are going to give you an idea of where blood would go. All right, so we're going to start up here, and we have this top chamber here where blood is being returned from the body to the heart. So if it's coming from the body, you have cells that are trying to get rid of waste. They're trying to get rid of like carbon dioxide, right? And they're pumping it, they're bringing it to the heart to be pumped to the lungs, so that the lungs can pick up oxygen and get rid of that carbon dioxide and other waste molecules. So if it's coming into the heart, we're going to identify this as deoxygenated blood, right? And because it's deoxygenated, typically the colors that you see with the heart are either red or blue or like a purple, right, to identify that stuff. And in this case, we're going to identify it with blue if it's deoxygenated, and we're going to identify it red if it's oxygenated. And so going off of what I said before, you have the right side of the human body. And so on that patient's right side, you would have the top chamber at the right atrium, the bottom chamber as the right ventricle. And then on the left side of that individual, you would have left atrium, left ventricle. So blood's going to come into the right atrium. It will make its way to the right ventricle. It will then leave out to go to the lungs, right? And then it's going to come back. So let's look and see how that works. So identifying the blood vessels, right? So think about your medical terminology. You know abbreviations for parts of the body, and that's going to help you out. You know bones. Bones, sometimes the blood vessels are named after the bones. So apply that information, whatever the abbreviation is for whatever organ it is, apply that information. Right? So when we think lungs, what's the abbreviation? What's the medical terminology term? What's the thing that you think of when you think of lungs? All right? So it should be pulmonary, right? So pulmonary tells me that it's dealing with the lungs. All right? So let's run through it again. Blood's coming back. It's coming back through the superior vena cava, inferior vena cava. It's dumping into the right atrium. It then will go through a valve here that's then going to send it into the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, we're going to go to the pulmonary trunk. From the pulmonary trunk, it splits. It goes to the right side of the body to the pulmonary artery, which then takes it to the right lung. and it'll go to the left pulmonary artery that takes it to the left lung. Oxygen exchange and carbon dioxide exchange happens in the lungs, obviously, and then you come back through a vein. So typically people think, okay, my veins are always deoxygenated and my arteries are always oxygenated. But there's basically 2 exceptions off the top of my head that I can think of for this. During fetal development, you have an exception there. Your lungs, you have an exception there. So pulmonary artery will have deoxygenated blood. Pulmonary vein will have oxygenated blood. You come back via the pulmonary vein, and so you have the pulmonary vein on the left and the right both empty into the left atrium. From there it goes down into the left ventricle. After it goes down into the left ventricle, it will then come up through another valve to then exit at the ascending aorta. It will then exit through some blood vessels that will take it to the arms and the head. And then the other blood goes to your lower body through the descending aorta. So looking at those areas that I just said go to the head and the arms, different models may end up showing you that right off the bat from that aortic arch, so the ascending aorta turns into the aortic arch, or the arch of the aorta. Right there at that arch, you have 3 blood vessels that come from it. Your brachiocephalic artery will branch into the right subclavian and then the right common carotid. Some models give you just a very small artery and then it branches into 2 immediately. Others will have a longer, I should say shorter. They'll give you a shorter artery that then branches into 2. Others will give you a longer artery that then branches into 2. Sometimes you don't even see that branching on the models, on a diagram that you have or the models that you have. But the brachiocephalic, brachio telling me brachial like shoulder arm, right? Think about your brachial plexus for the nerves. So brachio tells me that it's going there, cephalic's telling me head. So it makes sense that it's going to go to my subclavian artery. It's the right one because it's on my patient's right side, and then the right common carotid artery. And you've seen the common carotid before. You talked about it whenever you went over the skull with the holes in the head and you had the carotid canal. So you've seen this stuff before. So just applying what you know already. Now, the next branch that's coming off the aortic arch, that next tube there, so the blood vessel, it's going to be your left common carotid artery, and then we're all sticking to the left side of the body now, and so then you have that left subclavian. So really you're just identifying brachiocephalic branches into these 2, and they're all both on the right side, but on the left side you have the same 2 names. You have the common carotid artery and the subclavian artery, but they're on the left side. From there you have the descending aorta. It's going to go behind the heart and then come down, and it's going to supply the legs. So the lower trunk and then the legs. Valves. You already know that valves basically prevent backflow on blood vessels. That's the purpose. And so you're going to have valves in the heart that are larger, thicker valves that do the same thing. They're going to prevent regurgitation of blood. They try to prevent the blood from going back into a chamber that was already trying to block it off and trying to push it into a one-way. So it's like a one-way street. You don't want people to put in reverse. You don't want these blood cells to go in reverse. When that happens, you'll hear somebody talk about, oh, well, they had regurgitation of the blood at the mitral valve, right? So it's basically leaking through, going the wrong way. So here you have these different valves. When you look at the heart, they're all about the same level. So if you were to divide the heart, kind of cut it in half right here, you would see that at the bottom of the right atrium, there's a valve. At the top of the right ventricle is a valve. At the top of the left ventricle is a valve. At the bottom of the left atrium is a valve. Right? So you have these valves. When we throw that into this picture, though, it looks very cluttered. Right? So it's kind of a bit much. So let's just look at this individually, kind of clear that up a little bit for you. So you have your tricuspid valve, and the reason it's called tricuspid, tri tells me there's how many leaflets to it. There's 3 leaflets. So tri tells me there's 3. Then you have a bicuspid valve. Bicuspid, bi telling me that there's 2. And both of those will separate an atrium from a ventricle. So bicuspid, tricuspid. Now, those do have other names. So you will read bicuspid, tricuspid, but you may end up reading tricuspid and they'll say it's the atrioventricular, the right atrioventricular. So we're on the right side of our patient's heart and it's the atrioventricular valve on the right. Some abbreviate it. They may say it's the right AV valve, right? But we're talking about the tricuspid valve. Bicuspid valve has other names too. So just like the right AV, you have a left AV, atrioventricular, atrium and ventricle valve. But there's also another name for it. So you'll hear mitral valve. So that's pretty common that people say the mitral valve is having this issue or that issue. But we're talking about that bicuspid valve, that 2-leaflet valve that is located on the left side of the patient that separates the atrium from the ventricle. The aortic semilunar valve, so blood would come through the bicuspid valve into that thicker walled chamber on the left ventricle, right? It has a lot of force that has to force that blood up through that aortic semilunar valve. And there's so much force because it's got to go through the body, right? You got to try to get this blood all over the place. So lots of force to send it up into the aorta. And this particular valve here also has other names. So aortic semilunar valve is pretty common, but you'll also hear it called the left semilunar valve or the left atrial valve, even the aortic valve, right? So there's these other terms that are used. Now, the blood that's going to that pulmonary trunk through that pulmonary valve, right, is also known as the pulmonic valve or the right semilunar valve. So that's the other terminology for it. But if you think about the structure of the valve itself, what it's attaching to, typically you can either figure out the name of it based off of its structure or based off of where blood is going next. All right, so pulmonary valve, it goes to the pulmonary trunk. So that makes sense that it's the pulmonary valve. Aortic semilunar valve makes sense because it's going to the aorta, at the ascending aorta. Bicuspid valve makes sense because it's 2 leaflets there. Tricuspid valve makes sense because it's 3 leaflets there. So giving you an idea of what I just said, kind of broken down a little bit more. You do have these other terms, so just a heads up. So how does blood flow through the heart? Well, I've hit on it a little bit already, but basically your best bet is to find a starting place and trace the blood flow. So practice this. I would say start in one spot and learn how it goes through the heart and comes back to that spot. And then if you need to change up that spot to really test yourself, change it up. Typically people start, textbooks, you'll read it when you watch videos online, people start at the right atrium. That's a very common location to start the blood flow process. So if we start at the right atrium, we have deoxygenated blood there, right? It's being returned from the body to the heart, and it has to go through a valve. And what valve is it going to go through? What is the valve below the right atrium that connects it to the right ventricle? It is the tricuspid valve. From the tricuspid valve, it enters that chamber there, so you know that's the right ventricle. And now we need to go through a valve to get out of that chamber and to get into that pulmonary trunk. So we're going to the pulmonary trunk, so what's the valve? It's the pulmonary valve. From the pulmonary valve, we go to the pulmonary trunk, like I just said. And then pulmonary is telling me we're making our way to the lungs, and the trunk is going to branch off into vessels to get us there. And those vessels will end up being the pulmonary arteries, both the right one to take it to the right lung and the left one to take it to the left lung. In the lung, you will see that there's different small chambers located in the lung. And those alveoli will basically allow for the exchange of oxygen to take place. And the oxygenated blood is what will come back to the heart. So at this point, we're no longer going to deal with the blue colors. We're now going to deal with red colors, because the red is going to tell me that this contains oxygen. So the pulmonary vein on both the left and the right will bring it back to the heart. And specifically, where in the heart does this oxygenated blood go? It goes to the left side of the heart. It goes to the top chamber on the left, so that's your left atrium. And from there, it's going to have to go through a valve to get into the bottom chamber. And that valve, remember, some people called it the left AV, atrioventricular, but it also only has a certain number of leaflets to it. So how many leaflets are there? There's 2, so it's the bicuspid valve, mitral valve, left AV, atrioventricular valve. That's the name of this one. And then we come down to the left ventricle. And from there, we're coming back up through another valve. And this one is going to be a semi-lunar shape, right? So it sort of kind of has that moon shape to it. Semi-lunar valve, but specifically, where is it taking the blood to? It's taking it to the aorta. So this is going to be my aortic semi-lunar valve, taking it to my ascending aorta, bringing it to the arch of the aorta, which then takes it to the arteries that supply the head and the arms. And then from there, it's going to take it to the descending aorta. So some blood goes up to the head and the arms, and some blood goes down. Remember, the force is very great here to push that blood through that aortic semilunar valve and then to the aorta. Once it goes to the tissues of the body, it becomes deoxygenated because the cells are picking up the oxygen that they need and getting rid of carbon dioxide and waste products. And then it has to come back to the heart to then get pumped to the lungs. So to get back to the heart, you have the vena cava. So you have the superior vena cava, right? It's draining the stuff from the top, and the inferior vena cava ends up pulling the stuff from the lower body. And both of those meet up in that right atrium. So that right atrium is like the foyer to the heart. You get here, and then it gets ready to get pushed through, back through that tricuspid valve, into that right ventricle, and then we're working our way back to the lungs. So we're right back to the whole cycle. I would tell you one thing to do is to merge information as you study it. So if you are taking the lab class, right, then you probably have different models to see this heart. So you might find a heart on one model, and then there's another heart model, and then another heart model. Take every single model and merge it together. Identify the name of the structure on, like, say number 1 is this on this model, and the same name is structure number 7 on another model. Look at them. Trace blood flow through the heart on each model and compare and contrast as you do it. When you are in lecture, you're going to see that there's images of the heart in your textbook. Go through and compare and contrast. Work your way through the flow of blood through the heart. So merging it all, applying what you know, and then merge it between classes. So if you know this for lab, then turn around for lecture, boom, you know it for lecture, and vice versa. One thing to think about too is applying the other information that you know to what you have in front of you. So utilizing the blood flow to determine if there is a clot at structure whatever, will it cause a stroke? Could it potentially cause a blockage somewhere? So let's say your test question says, will a clot at this location where the stars are cause a stroke? Explain your answer. So based off of what you see, on every single model, the star is located on what? It's blue in color, so it's deoxygenated, and therefore it needs to go to the lungs. Lungs meaning that it's pulmonary. So here we are at the pulmonary trunk. If there is a blood clot at the pulmonary trunk, we're in a big blood vessel, right? As we get into the lungs, the blood vessels get smaller and smaller and smaller. The clot is likely to get lodged in the lung. If it gets lodged in the lung, then we have something that's called a pulmonary embolism. It's going to block off blood flow. The likelihood of it causing a stroke by going to the brain is it's not going to happen, because it would have to come all the way back through the lungs to the heart, then get pumped to the aorta and come up to the brain. So would it cause a stroke? No, it's going to cause a pulmonary embolism. And this is the reasoning behind it. All right, so just being able to apply what you know as you go through these. I hope this has helped you understand some information about heart anatomy and blood flow. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask. You can always drop me an email or just send me a message.